So it's my pleasure as chair this morning to introduce our president, Professor Bob White. Some of you are familiar with the history of Christians in Science. You'll know that we usually don't ask our presidents to do very much. They're simply our titular heads and some eminent person who sits at the top of our notepaper and so on. But it's a pleasure actually to have Bob with us this morning in person. Professor White is Emeritus Director of the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion in Cambridge. He's also the co-founder of the Institute with Dennis Alexander. Professor White has had a very distinguished academic career. He was Professor of Geophysics at the University of Cambridge, where he led a research group in the area of volcanoes and the dynamics of the Earth's crust. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1994, and in 2018 he received the Gold Medal of the Royal Astronomical Society in recognition of his life's work. This is the highest award that body awards. So throughout his career, Bob has also been very active in the field of science and religion, and he's written several books. I think the several is 8 at the last count. And these books have really addressed a Christian response to some of the problems of our age, particularly the ecological and environmental crises facing us, and especially those problems that arise from natural disasters. So we are extremely grateful that we have Bob with us, and he's taken time to be with us this morning, and we look forward to hearing his keynote address. So I'll hand over to Bob.
Thank you very much, Paul. Can you hear me? No, it's not. Oh, dear. Well, shall I use the hand?
It may be muted.
Right. You never know whether green is good or red is good, actually. How's that then? Can you hear me now? Great. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. So for the next half hour, I just want to talk a little bit about the faith of scientists, because as Paul says, there is a widespread perception still by the public at large and by scientists, if not by academics who study this, that science and faith are opposed. I think academically that's been debunked many, many years ago. But it's still out there, maybe 2/3 of the people, as Paul said. So it's helpful, isn't it, for people who aren't Christians but are scientists to see that some of those scientists that they look back on as being very eminent and have done great scientific work were actually Christians. And it's very helpful, I think, for Christians to know that there are scientists who have very strong faith as well. I mean, I think that's useful in our churches, where there is often an unthinking assumption that science and faith are opposed. So it's helpful both ways. So it's helpful for us to know as well. And it's an encouragement as well, as you look back at some of these people. So how do I pick which scientists to choose? I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds with great Christian faith that we could have talked about. Here's just a few of them. You'll notice Faraday's there, Michael Faraday, because the Faraday Institute is named after him. I think probably one of the greatest English scientists, actually. And John Ray, I'm also president of the John Ray Initiative, or vice president of the John Ray Initiative, which is specifically aimed at environmental issues. But there's lots of others, and their names you'll recognize. Interestingly, you'll see that it's written in Japanese at the top, because I gave a similar talk to this in Japan. And it makes the point that science is independent of culture or independent of where in the world you do it. If you do the same experiment in a different part of the world, it'll come out the same. As I said that, I just thought that actually gravity changes over the world. So if you measure gravity in different places, it's marginally different by a few millionths of a percent. But the idea is that the physics is the same. Okay, so we could have chosen very many. But this is what I decided to do. About a few years ago, to celebrate the 350th anniversary of the founding of the Royal Society in 1660, they issued 10 stamps. And I got a first day cover from them, which arrived in the post, and I looked at it and I thought, that one was a Christian, and that one was a Christian, and that one was a Christian, and quite a few of them were. Now, the interesting thing is the Royal Society absolutely did not choose these people based on their faith. They probably knew nothing about that. But they chose one person from every 35 years, because it was 350-year anniversary. Of course, they were first-class stamps. They didn't issue any second-class stamps. So I just thought we'd look at the faith of these 10, just as a representative sample of some of the greatest scientists that the Royal Society thought over the last 350 years. And it's quite interesting to do that. Science is interesting. I love this quote from Mark Twain. He's such a good source of quotes. There's something fascinating about science. One gets such a wholesale return of conjecture out of such a trifling investment of fact. And I know that's true because probably the best paper I ever wrote just had a few ideas which I thought would work. And it turned out they work in all sorts of other circumstances all over the world, the same thing. And it's still getting cited as much now, 20 years later, as it was 20 years ago, every year. And he's exactly right. The trick to science is knowing what to ignore, just to go for the jugular, if you like, the bit that explains most of it. So that's really helpful. Richard Feynman, great physicist, tragically died young. And you might remember that he was a person, actually you might not remember because some of you are younger, when Challenger blew up, the space shuttle blew up, he showed that it was due to O-rings which were sealing the rocket fuel, becoming brittle because it had been below zero in the launch pad the day before. And he showed it just very dramatically before the congressional inquiry by taking one of these little rubber O-rings, they're very small, and just dipping it in some ice, a glass of iced water, which they had on the desk, and then lift it and crack it in half. I mean, brilliant scientist who could explain complicated things in a very simple way. But he was not a man of faith at all, but he said science has organised scepticism in the reliability of expert opinion. And I think that's a great quote as well. And it's actually what the Royal Society was founded on, as I'll show you in just a minute. And Richard Dawkins is always a great source of quotes, isn't he? Religious beliefs are irrational, religious beliefs are dumb and dumber, super dumb. So it's quite easy to counter that, isn't it, if you're going to be so extreme. And then more recently, Peter Atkins, another well-known atheist. I was sent his book to review, his book about a scientist's exploration of the great questions of existence. All actions, be they physical or cerebral, are purposeless, he says in this book. And his conclusion is, this is a sound and firm foundation for the joy of true comprehension. I don't know what your lives are like, but I think his must be pretty miserable, actually, to be honest, if that's what he thinks gives you a great joy. So just some backgrounds of the sort of milieu in which we're working. Now, the Royal Society its founding in 1660 was really the start of science as an organised activity. They published their results, and actually they have the longest continuous publication list of any scientific journal in the world. And it was founded by 12 men, they were all men in those days, who met together in Gresham College, then founded the Royal Society. And they had strong reasons for doing this. And their motto tells you what it is, really. Nullius in verba, which broadly translated means take no one's word for it. So this actually is pre-echoing those things we've just read from Richard Feynman and Mark Twain as well, for that matter, that if you want to find out how the world works, you should go and have a look. And don't just take received wisdom. You know, don't just see what the Greek philosophers said and then recycle it and recycle it. Actually go and have a look, see how it works. And that is the basis of the scientific method. So it was founded in 1660, King Charles II, and they still have his charter. This is the original charter. And it's quite interesting to read his description of why he did it. He wrote in the preamble to this charter that one of his reasons for giving a charter to the Royal Society, that's why it's the Royal Society, was so that he would always be recognised not only as the defender of the faith, which of course is still the title of our sovereign, but also as the universal lover and patron of every kind of truth. So there's also something deeply embedded in science, that it's seeking truth, much as religion does, in much the same way, if you like. And actually the reason for doing science by those 12 people that set it up is proclaimed in this charter as well. The Society's studies are to be applied to further promoting by the authority of experiments, the sciences of natural things and of useful arts, that's I think technology and engineering is what they meant by that. To the glory of God, number one, glory of God the Creator. Number two, the advantage of the human race. So this was the reason why those 12 people thought it was worth doing science, not just for idle intellectual curiosity, but actually you could make people's lives better. And of course it has made people's lives better. I would probably not be standing here if I'd lived in 1660, because I'd be dead by now, and actually several of us would be. You know, and we've eradicated a lot of diseases completely. I think it's a great gift of God that a vaccine was developed for COVID so quickly and so effectively. I mean, all kinds of things in medicine, in technology, and so on. So this was their vision, and I think this is what drives a lot of science. Augustine put it quite simply in a way, nature is what God does, or nature is what God is doing is another way you can translate what he wrote, in Latin, of course. So when you're studying the natural world, or if you say, well, that's just nature, actually you're saying, if you believe in a creator God, that is God working. And I think that's also a very helpful perspective. It was put more strongly, perhaps, by Francis Bacon in the 16th century, and this also is a well-known sort of way of thinking about science and religion. God must first be known from nature, what's around us, like Paul said in Romans, and afterwards recognized from doctrine. From nature by his works, what he's done, and from doctrine by his revealed works, in other words, by science and scripture. And of course, we can't know what God intends to do unless he tells us, otherwise we're just creating him in our own image. And that's what Francis Bacon has said, and I think that's still true today, that we have this twin track. And I think scientists are incredibly privileged to be able to sit in the middle of this, actually. So I always thought I've had a great career studying volcanoes and earthquakes and going to great places, and I was paid to do that. And not only was I paid to do it, but I was studying God's creation doing it. I mean, I think that's an immense privilege. I love this photo, actually, this statue of Francis Bacon. He looks so worn out from all his thinking, sitting there in the foyer of the Trinity College Chapel. Well, people may not realize this. Darwin comes in, you know, Darwin is often held up as the epitome of science, which sort of removes the need for faith. But if you actually look in the first edition of his Origin of Species, it has some words on the left, which you might not be able to read from there, so I'll just enlarge them. And he actually quoted Bacon on the flyleaf of his book. Let no man think or maintain that a man can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's word, the Bible, or in the book of God's works, the world around us. But rather let men endeavour an endless progress or proficiency in both. So there it is, right on the first edition of the Origin of Species. I mean, sadly, he removed it from the second and further editions, but it's there in the very first one. What he didn't quote was what Bacon went on to say, which I also think I should just share with you in that quote from Bacon. He said, only let people, we'd say today, beware that they apply both to charity and not to swelling, to use and not to ostentation. And I think that actually would be quite a good lesson to teach many scientists today who are sort of arrogant about their great knowledge. And people do have great knowledge. You know, we can do lots of things that we couldn't do before. And it does tempt you to be rather overproud about your own achievements or the achievements of science. And that's one of the issues, I think, in the societal discussion of science today. When this issue comes up, I often say, you know, that's great, science is wonderful, but actually we only know just a tiny bit, because it's all provisional, about 3% of the universe. 97% of it is dark energy or dark matter that we know absolutely nothing about. Let men beware they apply both to love and not to pride. Okay, so those were just a few background things. Let's just get back to the stamps. First one, Robert Boyle. Robert Boyle was a great Christian man. He was one of the richest people in Britain, had a lot of holdings in Ireland, and he did a lot of incredibly good work setting up Bible societies in India to translate the Bible, and also in North America. But he also really got going the whole business of chemistry, rather than it being alchemy, putting it on a sound basis. One of his major contributions was this textbook called A Skeptical Chemist. And on that, tells you that, I mean, they always have a subtitle which tells you all about it. But he also wrote this book called The Christian Virtuoso, and the subtitle again tells you what it's all about. It's that by being addicted to experimental philosophy, that's science, a man, and now we'd say a person, is rather assisted than indisposed to be a good Christian. So right up at the beginning, and he was one of the founders of the Royal Society, in fact, he really believed and he lived out his life with the idea that being a really good scientist meant you could be a really good Christian, actually. It actually helped you be that. Again, which is an attitude which I think many of our fellow scientists don't even think about, actually. And I think it's worth knowing these things just to bring it up, drop it into the conversation. Isaac Newton was for the next 35 years. In fact, he was, interestingly, was a Unitarian, although he was in Trinity College, Cambridge. And at the time, actually, that was, it was blasphemy, which theoretically was punishable by death. So he sort of kept that fairly quiet, I think. But I don't know if you know this, but he wrote far more words on religion than he did on maths or science. And he spent a lot of his time on religion, slightly strange, but it was religion. And in his Principia, which incidentally, probably some of you know this, the great book on maths. Do you know how many equations there were in his Principia? Actually, none, 0. He never wrote down an equation. All the discussion was in words, actually, not a single mathematical equation in there. Anyway, in the preface, which was written by somebody called Roger Coates, he said, "The order of nature was established by the will of God, and he must be blind who from the most wise and excellent contrivances of things, the way the world is, cannot see the infinite wisdom and goodness of their almighty creator. And he must be mad and senseless who refuses to acknowledge him." That's pretty in your face, isn't it, actually? For such an influential book. He died, and there's a famous death mask of him. He was an interesting character, actually. He wasn't a great sort of character, actually. He was rather vengeful, I'm afraid. But one thing he did, he used to write things in code, really, in shorthand code, but people have deciphered it. And this was something he wrote just before Whitsun 62, and it was a list of all his failings, his sins. Let me just blow up a few of them. Stealing cherry cobs from Edward's store, you see, and then the next sin was denying that he'd done so. Number 20, setting my heart on money, learning pleasure, more than God. And then 21 is a relapse, 22 is a relapse. So this sort of sounds familiar to us, doesn't it, really? 24 was punching my sister. I'm sorry, we shouldn't really laugh, should we? But he was pretty serious about this. But it's quite good he wrote it in code, really, isn't it, actually? Anyway, when another thing that Isaac Newton wrote was he was concerned. I mean, he was talking about the motion of planets around the sun, and he was concerned that they didn't actually stay in their place properly in exact circles and so on. And so he thought God had to nudge them back into position every now and then to keep them going. This most elegant system of the sun, planets, and comets could not have arisen without the design and dominion of an intelligent, powerful being. I mean, he certainly, in his science, he saw God's hand. Now, we would say he was wrong in that particular assumption, but it was there in his thinking, and it enabled him to take these great leaps of imagination that this system could work, because God could make it work if he wanted to. Okay, Benjamin Franklin was next. He was US ambassador to Paris. I mean, he was a sort of a great Renaissance man in that sense. And he didn't have a deep personal faith, but he had a sort of conventional religious faith, if you like. So here were some words from his almanac. And this is something he wrote. How many observe Christ's birthday, Christmas? How few his precepts? It's easier to keep holidays than commandments. A very perceptive view, isn't it, actually? And I actually wonder, some of our colleagues, you know, if you ask them what Christmas is about, quite a lot of them won't know it's about the birth of Christ, even astonishingly. I was talking to some of my PhD students at Cambridge, who, you know, you would think would be moderately intelligent, about Daniel in the lion's den, and they had not a clue it was a Bible story. They thought it was a TV program that they were talking about. So he had Benjamin Franklin had a sort of conventional faith. I think he was a deist more than a theist, if you like. He believed in a God that was out there, just not really interfering in our lives, but setting things going. But he said, I believe in one God, the creator of the universe, that he governs by his providence, that he ought to be worshipped, that the most acceptable service we render to him is doing good to his other children, that the soul of man is immortal and will be treated with justice in another life, respecting its conduct in this. This is, you know, that's all okay stuff, isn't it? He wasn't so sure about Jesus. And he wrote this letter to his friend when he was clearly dying. It was in his very last few weeks. As to Jesus of Nazareth, I think his system of morals and his religion, as he left them to us, the best the world ever saw is likely to see. I mean, that's another thing people often think, isn't it, that Jesus was a great moral teacher, and, you know, you see it in obituaries sometimes he was a great Christian man, meaning that he was upright and honest and moral and so on, rather than he had great faith. But I apprehend some doubts as to his divinity, he said, though it's a question I do not dogmatise upon, having never studied it, and I think it needless to busy myself with it now, when I expect soon an opportunity of knowing the truth with less trouble, because he knew he was dying. Edward Jenner, of course, invented vaccinations, actually, so we ought to be grateful to him. A lot of concern about it at the time. This was a cartoon from Punch where they thought if you had this vaccine from cowpox, you know, you'd start growing horns and looking like a cow and so on. I mean, there's a sort of an element of that around still, isn't it, with the current vaccine. He was sort of a conventional religious person. His father was a vicar, I think, actually, and he was vice president of the Cheltenham Bible Society. And he wrote this: the whole creation is the work of God's hands. It cannot manage itself. Man cannot manage it. Therefore, God is the manager, was what he said. So he had religious faith in that sense. Charles Babbage certainly had a deep Christian faith. In fact, he thought of being a vicar at one time. He invented a computing system, the computers as we know it today, really, was the forerunner of that. And there had been a series which was sponsored by the Royal Society called the Bridgewater Treatise, of which there had been 8. He hadn't been asked to write one of them, so he thought he'd just write a 9th one himself and pay for it himself, which he did. And this was to show the importance of faith and science going together. So the study of the works of nature with scientific precision is a necessary and indispensable preparation to the understanding and interpreting their testimony of the wisdom and goodness of their divine creator, of their divine author, was what he wrote in that, and a lot else besides. So another great Christian man, actually, behind everything we do with computers and mobile phones and so on today, you know. And I bet a lot of our contemporaries don't even know that, actually. It's a great thing to remember. Wallace was, interestingly, they didn't put Darwin in for evolution. They put Wallace, who was a rather less titled. He wasn't a gentleman in the way that Darwin was. He was really a collector of plants. He worked in the Far East a lot of his life. And in fact, he came up with something similar to the theory of evolution at the same time as Darwin. And Darwin had typically been really slow about publishing. He'd been thinking about it for years and years and years and hadn't got round to it. And then this letter came from Wallace with the same idea. Now, in the end, they presented both at the same time, both ideas, but Darwin, of course, in the end, became preeminent, really. He's the one that's remembered for it. But Wallace had thought of this. Now, he wasn't a Christian. In fact, although he'd been brought up as a Christian, he sort of turned away from it, but he still saw spiritual truths behind reality. And he wrote books about it. He went a bit, one of the reasons that he was never really accepted into scientific society, if you like, at the time, was that he became a spiritualist and defended some rather dubious people who had been doing trickery, really, you know, like of the bending spoons variety, to try and prove spiritual reality. So he sort of was discredited through that, really. And though he was a fellow of the Royal Society and so on, as you can see there. And he did think there was a spiritual dimension to the world, which was necessary for the world to work. Joseph Lister, one of the people who invented antiseptic means that our medics here will know all about. So the carbolic spray was something that he invented. He too had, he became president of the Royal Society, and he was a bit reticent about his faith because we were sort of entering the period now in the 19th century, end of the 19th, beginning of 20th century, where science was seen as a more secular activity and people started to divide the two, rather than up to that time it was automatically thought that, you know, that it was part of your life, your science and your faith. And he wrote this, but he didn't allow it to be published until after he'd finished being president of the Royal Society. I have no hesitation, he said, in saying that in my opinion there's no antagonism between the religion of Jesus Christ and any fact scientifically established. Ernest Rutherford, sort of a great person who invented splitting of the atom and so on, worked in Cambridge at the time, a New Zealander. In fact, I knew his great-granddaughter quite well. She became president of Darwin College. In fact, she just retired this last year. He had a conventional faith, but he wasn't particularly religious. Apparently, so his great-granddaughter told me, when things in the lab were going well, he would go around humming "Onward, Christian Soldiers." When things were going badly, he'd hum "Fight the Good Fight." And he also insisted on closing the lab on Sundays, actually, which again is, I think, was a great example, really. You cannot come in. He locked the lab, so they couldn't do any work on Sunday. But as I say, he had no particular personal faith, although he was actually put on the Papal Commission in 1936, I think it was, for science and faith, actually. But he wasn't antagonistic to faith. Actually, there's a story about being eminent. Of course, he was Sir Ernest Rutherford, and he died in his late 60s, I think it was, because he'd been chopping down some trees in his garden in Newnham in Cambridge. And he'd got a hernia, and so they took him to Adam Brooks Hospital. And they could have operated on it straight away, but the convention at the time was you'd only be operated on by somebody of an equivalent or higher rank. And so they had to haul somebody up from London. And the chap couldn't get there till the next day, by which time he'd died. So having great rank is not necessarily a big advantage, is what I take from that. Of course, the lab he worked on, this is a famous picture of the Cavendish Laboratory where he worked, just inside these doors on the right. They renovated it recently and they took up the floorboards. It was full of mercury underneath, all the mercury that had leaked through. Magna opera domini esquisire in omnes voluntatis eius, it says across the door, these lovely oak doors, which is a quote from Psalm 111, which you'll all know very well. Now, when the new Cavendish Laboratory was founded in the 60s, they actually were persuaded by Andrew Briggs, who's in Oxford, to put the same quote above those doors, but in English. In fact, the Coverdale translation. The works of the Lord are great, sought out of all them that have pleasure therein. And actually, there is now a third Cavendish Laboratory being built, and they're working hard to try and get it put on that. I think it's more of an uphill battle at the moment. But at the very least, I think they're going to take down this plaque and put it in the library or the dining room or something so that people can see it. So embedded again in the vision of doing physics. Dorothy Hodgkin came from conventional Christian parents, was a Quaker. I don't think she had any particular faith, although she was a great, compassionate, empathetic woman. Nick Shackleton, the last one they chose, I knew quite well because he was in my department. He was a geophysicist. Again, died of cancer just in his late 60s, tragically. I don't think he had any particular faith either. But you can sort of see, as the years go by, that it becomes more likely that you're going to not talk publicly about your faith, which I think is also sometimes difficult for us, isn't it, when we're sitting in the common room to talk about our faith in a natural way with our colleagues and students. So if you take the total tally of those stamps I looked at, 50% of them were seriously religious and took their faith seriously. 20% of them, Jenner and Wallace, were spiritual. They thought there was a higher force than just science. And then 30% were probably straight down the line of secularist, even though perhaps people like Rutherford would go to church on Sunday and so on. Interestingly, Elaine Eklund, who some of you might have heard of, did some surveys more recently in 2010 of 2,200 American scientists. Actually, it came out just the same. 50% are religious. That means they attended church or religious meetings regularly. 20% said they were spiritual, but they didn't attend religious meetings, and 30% said they were secularists, though they didn't see science, religion in conflict. I think there's more nowadays of the sort of NOMA idea that, well, you know, that's very nice for you. If you want to do that, that's fine. It doesn't affect my science. So interestingly, things haven't changed much over the 350 years that have gone past. So that's the sort of split you'll find when you do these surveys. I thought I ought to finish with just a couple of people that have died in the last 2 years during the COVID pandemic, both of whom were great friends of Faraday, certainly. John Polkinghorne, that many of us will know, very eminent theoretical physicist, who then, to the amazement, really, of a lot of his colleagues, just left physics, became ordained, was a parish priest, and then was president of Queen's College, Cambridge, and so on, and wrote a lot of theology and did amazing talks for people. I can remember actually him coming to Faraday to give a talk, and it was 2 days after his wife had died, which was really sad because they'd been married for, I think it was 45 years, a long time anyhow. And typically he would just turn up with literally the back of an envelope. I mean, literally had the back of an envelope with 3 words written on it. I was standing next to him so I could see it. And he gave an hour's talk on the basis of that. And actually, I think he was so professional that actually I think he found it helpful to stand up and give a talk about stuff he was so deeply embedded in while he was going through this trauma, in a way, of his wife dying. So he was a great loss to us, but he died in old age, so he was 91, as you can see. The other Sir John I want to just mention is Sir John Houghton, whom you maybe have heard less about, who also died a couple of years ago. And in fact, his memorial service is next Saturday, which I'll be speaking at in Wales. Now, he was a great man of faith, as well as very eminent scientist. He led a group that made the first instruments to measure the temperature of the upper atmosphere, stratosphere, from satellites, measuring carbon dioxide. But probably his most important contribution was that he set up the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and he chaired the first 3 rounds of meetings for the first 12 years or so. And he was really committed to truth in science and truth in faith. And I think that actually the world owes more to him than probably any other living person at the moment, because he set up the IPCC as intergovernmental panel, so anybody from any nation could come, but he was absolutely insistent that science was preeminent. You must be truthful to the science. What this meant was, when they had these meetings to finalise the reports, which came out every 4 years, they had to have consensus. It wasn't just a vote. And anybody could protest. And of course, there were strong lobbies from Saudi Arabia, from the oil companies, and so on, lobbying against it, just as there still are today. And they went on way into the night over the deadlines, sometimes till 3 a.m. before they got consensus on every single word in those reports. But he always insisted on truth being preeminent in those. And the result of that is that the IPCC reports, which come out every 4 years, there's one just coming out now at the moment, the 6th assessment report, are really beyond reproach, and people just accept them. And the arguments now are what to do about it. And this is what happens at the conventions of the parties, like COP26, which just happened in Glasgow recently. And of course, there's plenty of argument about that. But the reports themselves, the evidence there, is not really seriously contested at all. And I think it was primarily due to John Houghton's insistence, because of his Christian faith, on truth being preeminent in these reports and not shortcutting it. And so, as I say, I think that probably globally the world owes a huge amount to him. I was talking about him to a friend recently, and they said, well, who's ever heard of John Houghton? Like, you know, everybody's heard of Greta Thunberg, who's had far more impact. Well, Greta Thunberg has had big impact, but she can only have that impact because of what John Houghton and the IPCC did. And so I think, you know, in the scheme of things, he's been an immense contributor to humanity, if you like, put it that way. And it was because of his Christian faith, which was underpinning all of that. So I wanted to finish with that. There are some handouts. I've written a little article about this, and you can pick these up in the coffee break off the table there. Please do that takeaway. You can read a bit more detail about these 10 at least, and there's other references to things other people have written about. So let me stop there. Hand you back to our chair. Thanks.